Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Martin Heidegger, the philosopher of being's deepest mysteries. Together and apart, they mapped the interior landscapes where existence reveals itself, where authenticity emerges from concealment, and where the human being confronts the strange terrain of its own depths. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the question of what it means to truly exist, one seeing the archetypal depths of the psyche manifesting through symbol and myth, the other discovering the ontological structure of being itself, revealed through existential inquiry. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Heidegger as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the early years of the 20th century, when the world still carried the weight of Victorian certainties, even as those certainties began to crack and crumble, two children were growing up in German-speaking lands, each destined to transform how humanity understands its own existence. Carl Gustav Jung, born in 1875 in the quiet Swiss village of Keswil, carried within him from his earliest days a peculiar sensitivity to what he would later call the two personalities within himself, the ordinary boy of his time and place, and something older, something that seemed to remember vast stretches of human experience. Martin Heidegger, born 14 years later in 1889 in the small Catholic town of Meßkirch in Baden-Württemberg, grew up in the shadow of the church tower, the son of a sexton, immersed in the rhythms of Catholic liturgy and the question of being that would haunt him throughout his days. These were men shaped by landscapes, Jung by the waters of Lake Constance, by the deep woods of Switzerland, by the stone walls of the Basel Cathedral where his father served as pastor, by dreams that seemed to pierce through the surface of ordinary life into older, stranger territories. Heidegger by the Black Forest, by the peasant farmhouses with their deep-rooted connection to earth, by the question that arose whenever the church bells rang out. Across the fields, the question of what it means for something to be, to exist, to stand forth into presence. Jung's path into the depths began early. His childhood was marked by dreams of such power and strangeness that they left impressions deeper than waking life. The dream of the underground phallus god, encountered when he was only 3 or 4 years old, remained with him as a kind of first encounter with what he would later understand as the numinous power of the unconscious, the archaic religious depths that exist beneath our civilized surfaces. His adolescence was marked by that strange division he felt within himself. Personality number 1, the schoolboy who struggled with mathematics and social niceties, and personality number 2, the old man who seemed to carry the wisdom of centuries, who felt more at home in the world of Goethe and the ancient philosophers than among his contemporaries. When Jung entered the University of Basel to study medicine in 1895, he carried with him questions that most medical students did not entertain. What is the relationship between mind and matter? How do we account for the strange phenomena that seem to bridge the material and spiritual worlds? His interest in spiritualism, in seances, in his cousin Helene Preiswerk's mediumistic trances, pointed toward a fascination with the borderlands between consciousness and something else, something that seemed to have its own autonomous reality, its own intelligence, its own purposes. His choice of psychiatry as a specialty came as a revelation. Reading Richard von Krafft-Ebing's textbook, Jung discovered that psychiatry was the field where the biological and the spiritual met, where the mysteries of the psyche could be approached scientifically without reducing them to mere mechanism. He took up his position at the Burghölzli Mental Hospital in Zurich in 1900, working under Eugen Bleuler, and began the word association experiments that would first bring him to prominence. These experiments, which measured the time it took for patients to respond to stimulus words, revealed what Jung called complexes, autonomous emotional clusters in the psyche that had their own energy, their own agenda, that could hijack consciousness and produce symptoms, slips of the tongue, delays in response. Already, even in these early experimental years, Jung was developing a vision of the psyche as something more than a blank slate or a collection of learned responses. The complexes behaved like little personalities, like sub-selves with their own perspectives, and in the dreams and fantasies of his patients, Jung began to notice recurring motifs, symbols that appeared without the patients having any cultural knowledge of their traditional meanings: the mandala, the quaternity, the divine child, the wise old man, the great mother. His collaboration with Sigmund Freud, beginning in 1906, was both productive and ultimately constraining. Jung found in Freud a father figure, a bold explorer of the unconscious, a man who dared to speak of sexuality and the hidden forces that shape our lives. But Jung could not accept Freud's reduction of the unconscious to personal, repressed material, particularly sexual material. Jung's experiences with psychotic patients at the Burghölzli, his own dreams and visions, his wide reading in mythology and comparative religion, all of this pointed towards something deeper than the personal unconscious. There seemed to be layers of the psyche that were not personal at all, that belonged to the species, to humanity as a whole, perhaps even to life itself. The break with Freud, when it came between 1912 and 1913, precipitated Jung into his own dark night of the soul, what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. For several years, Jung deliberately allowed himself to descend into the depths, recording his visions and active imaginations in what would become the Red Book. He encountered figures from the unconscious Philemon, the wise old man with kingfisher wings, who taught him that thoughts and psychic contents have a life of their own. Salome, the blind prophetess, the terrible god Abraxas, who encompassed both good and evil. Through this descent, Jung developed his mature understanding of the collective unconscious, that layer of the psyche that contains the archetypes, the primordial images and patterns that structure human experience across all cultures and times. By the time the First World War ravaged Europe, Jung had emerged from his own inner war with a new vision. The psyche was not merely personal. It contained transpersonal dimensions, layers that connected the individual to the whole human story, to patterns of meaning encoded in myth and symbol. The goal of psychological development, which Jung called individuation, was not merely to resolve neurotic conflicts, but to establish a conscious relationship with these deeper layers, to honor both ego and self, to integrate the shadow to differentiate oneself from collective identifications while also finding one's place in the larger patterns of meaning. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, as Jung developed his theory of psychological types, his understanding of the anima and animus, his studies of alchemy as a symbolic representation of the individuation process, he was articulating a vision of the psyche as inherently meaningful, as structured by archetypal patterns that manifest in symbols, dreams, myths, and religious experiences. For Jung, the symbol was the central fact of psychological life, not a sign that merely points to something else, but a living reality that participates in what it represents, that mediates between consciousness and the unconscious, that allows what is unknown to become partially known without losing its numinous power. While Jung was making his descent into the unconscious and emerging with his maps of the archetypal depths, Martin Heidegger was following a different path toward a different kind of depth. Heidegger's formation was thoroughly Catholic. As a young man, he entered seminary training with the Jesuits, intending to become a priest. But his health was fragile, and after brief periods with both the Jesuits and the diocesan seminary, he turned to philosophy, studying at the University of Freiburg under Heinrich Rickert, and, crucially, reading Edmund Husserl's Phenomenology. Phenomenology, the method developed by Husserl to return to the things themselves, to examine phenomena as they present themselves to consciousness without imposing theoretical frameworks, gave Heidegger his starting point. But Heidegger would transform phenomenology into something Husserl never intended, turning it from an examination of consciousness toward an examination of being itself, of existence as such. Heidegger's early work was concerned with the philosophy of medieval scholasticism, with Duns Scotus and the question of categories. But gradually, through his reading of Aristotle, through his immersion in the pre-Socratic philosophers, through his experience of the First World War and the collapse of the old European order, Heidegger came to formulate the question that would drive all his subsequent work, the question of being. Not what this or that being is, not what properties things have, but what it means to be at all. What is the meaning of being? How has this question been forgotten in Western philosophy? And how might we recover it? When Heidegger took up his position at the University of Marburg in 1923, he was already developing the radical existential analysis that would culminate in his masterwork, Being and Time, published in 1927. This was the same year Jung published his work on the structure of the psyche, but the two men were working in entirely different registers, though both were concerned with what lies beneath the surface of everyday life, with what it means to live authentically rather than inauthentically, with the structures that shape human existence often without our awareness. Being and Time is a dense, difficult, revolutionary text. Heidegger invented a new philosophical vocabulary because he believed that traditional philosophical language was so contaminated by metaphysical assumptions that it could not ask the question of being properly. He wrote of Dasein literally, being there, his term for human existence, for that being who is characterized by an understanding of being, who is concerned about its own being, whose being is always an issue for it. Dasein is thrown into the world, always already situated in a context it did not choose, among others, within a particular historical moment. Dasein is being in the world, not a subject facing objects, but always already involved with things, using them, dwelling among them, understanding them in terms of their relevance to human projects and concerns. For Heidegger, most of the time Dasein exists in a mode he calls das Man. The they, absorbed in everydayness, understanding itself in terms of what one does, following the dictates of convention and social norms, fleeing from its own most authentic possibilities. This everyday existence is characterized by idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity, ways of relating to the world and to oneself that stay on the surface, that avoid the deeper questions, that cover over the strangeness and the anxiety that would arise if we really confronted our own existence. But Dasein can be called back to authenticity. And one of the primary ways this happens is through anxiety, not fear of this or that particular thing, but angst, the uncanny mood in which the familiar world becomes strange, in which all the everyday relevances and meanings fall away, in which Dasein confronts the sheer fact of its existence, its thrownness, its being toward death. In anxiety, Dasein experiences what Heidegger calls the nothing, not some metaphysical void, but the collapse of all familiar meanings, revealing that these meanings are not given, not necessary, but possibilities that Dasein itself has projected. Central to Heidegger's existential analysis is the fact of mortality. Dasein is being toward death. Death is not simply an event that will happen at some future time. It is a constitutive feature of Dasein's being. To exist authentically is to anticipate death, not in a morbid way, but as owning up to one's finitude, to the fact that one's existence is not infinite, that one must choose how to be within this limited span. Anticipating death individualizes Dasein, pulls it out of the anonymous they, and confronts it with its own most possibility, the possibility of impossibility, the limit that cannot be surpassed. Through this confrontation, through this anxiety and this recognition of finitude, Dasein can achieve what Heidegger calls authenticity, Eigentlichkeit, literally ownness, being one's own, taking responsibility for one's existence, rather than losing oneself in the crowd. Authentic Dasein hears the call of conscience, not a moral voice, but an existential summons, calling Dasein back from its lostness in the they, calling it to take up its own possibility. This involves what Heidegger calls resoluteness, not resolving to do this or that particular thing, but the fundamental resolve to be oneself, to own one's thrownness, to project oneself forward into possibilities that one authentically chooses. Heidegger's analysis of time is equally radical. He argues that the traditional understanding of time as a sequence of now points, as a container in which events occur, misses the fundamental temporality of Dasein's existence. Dasein is always already stretched out between its past facticity, thrownness, what it already is, its future projection, possibility, what it might become, and its present, the moment of vision in which authentic choice occurs. These are not separate moments, but dimensions of a unified temporal structure. And it is this temporal structure that makes meaning possible. Things have meaning in terms of their relevance to projects that stretch from past into future. By the 1930s, Heidegger's thought was taking what scholars call the turn die Kehre. He moved away from the existential analysis of Dasein toward a more meditative thinking about being itself, about how being has been progressively forgotten in Western history, concealed by metaphysics, covered over by technology's will to mastery and control. In his later work, Heidegger wrote increasingly about language as the house of being, about poetry as a privileged mode of unconcealment, about dwelling as a mode of authentic being in the world, about the fourfold of earth, sky, mortals, and divinities. Heidegger's involvement with National Socialism, his brief tenure as rector of Freiburg University during the Nazi period, his public speeches in support of Hitler, these remain a dark and contested chapter, one that complicates any reception of his philosophy. After the war, Heidegger was banned from teaching for several years. He never fully acknowledged or adequately apologized for his Nazi involvement, though his later work on technology and the dangers of totalizing systems can be read as an indirect reckoning with what had happened. This political dimension is important to name as we consider his thought, even as we explore the philosophical depths he articulated. Jung and Heidegger were contemporaries, both at the height of their powers in the decades between the two world wars. Both were writing in German. Both were responding to the crisis of meaning that characterized 20th century Europe, the collapse of religious certainty, the rise of mass society, the experience of war and totalitarianism. Both were suspicious of the rationalism and scientism that characterize much of modern thought. Both were interested in what lies beneath the surface of everyday consciousness, in the structures or forces or realities that shape human existence without being fully transparent to awareness. Yet, there is no evidence that Jung and Heidegger ever met, or that they engaged directly with each other's work. They inhabited different worlds, Jung, the medical and psychological world, oriented toward therapy, toward helping individuals integrate unconscious material and move toward wholeness. Heidegger, the academic philosophical world, oriented toward the fundamental question of being, toward recovering something that Western metaphysics had lost. Jung's audience was primarily psychiatrists, analysts, people interested in the practical work of understanding dreams and symbols in psychic development. Heidegger's audience was primarily philosophers, though his influence would eventually spread into literary criticism, theology, and cultural theory. Still, there are intriguing intersections. Both men were influenced by German Romanticism's emphasis on depth, inwardness, the limits of rationality. Both drew on pre-Socratic philosophy, finding in Heraclitus and the early Greek thinkers a wisdom that later philosophy had covered over. Both were fascinated by language, Jung by the symbolic language of the unconscious, Heidegger by the ontological power of language to disclose being. Both valued something they might call authenticity, though they understood this term quite differently. Both saw anxiety or confrontation with difficult truths as essential to genuine existence or psychological development. And both, it must be said, have been criticized for aspects of their work and lives that trouble contemporary readers. Jung for his ambiguous statements about Judaism and his initial involvement with the German psychotherapy organization under the Nazis. Heidegger far more damningly for his active Nazi participation. These are not merely biographical details, but raise questions about whether certain aspects of their thought, Jung's emphasis on archetypal differences between peoples, Heidegger's blood and soil rhetoric in his Nazi period speeches were connected to these political failures. As we explore the dialogue between these two minds, we are not engaging in hagiography. We are examining two profound but flawed thinkers who, each in his own way, tried to articulate something about the depths of human existence that modern rationalism had forgotten or dismissed. Their insights remain powerful and challenging even where we must critically examine their limitations. The cultural context that shaped both men was the crisis of modernity in German-speaking Europe. By the early 20th century, the optimistic rationalism of the Enlightenment had been challenged from multiple directions. Nietzsche had declared God dead and the old values, exhausted. Marx had unmasked ideology and revealed the economic forces shaping consciousness. Freud had shown that the rational ego was not master in its own house. The First World War had demonstrated that technological progress and rational planning could produce unprecedented horror. The rise of mass society, of mechanization, of what Max Weber called the iron cage of bureaucratic rationality, all of this created a longing for depth, for authenticity, for something that could not be reduced to mechanism or calculation. Both Jung and Heidegger responded to this crisis by turning to pre-modern sources of wisdom. Jung immersed himself in alchemy, Gnosticism, Eastern philosophy, mythology, traditions that understood the psyche as having its own autonomous reality, its own wisdom that could not be reduced to rational consciousness. Heidegger turned to the pre-Socratics, to medieval mystics like Meister Eckhart, to poets like Hölderlin, sources that still possessed, he believed, a more original understanding of being before metaphysics flattened and concealed it. Both men were also influenced by Romanticism's emphasis on the non-rational dimensions of human experience. The Romantic movement had insisted that imagination, emotion, symbol, and myth were not inferior to reason, but possessed their own forms of truth. Goethe, whom both Jung and Heidegger admired deeply, had written of the symbol as that which, while remaining itself, represents something universal. The German idealists, particularly Schelling, had explored the relationship between nature and spirit, between unconscious creation and conscious reflection. This romantic heritage gave both Jung and Heidegger permission to explore territories that positivist science dismissed as merely subjective or irrational. There was also a shared sense that something had been lost in modernity, that earlier modes of existence had possessed a wholeness or a rootedness that modern fragmentation had destroyed. For Jung, this manifested in his idea that modern consciousness had become too one-sided, too identified with the rational ego, cut off from the symbolic life that had sustained humanity for millennia. The loss of living connection to myth and ritual, Jung believed, produced neurosis, the psyche's protest against meaninglessness, its demand for reconnection with archetypal depths. For Heidegger, the loss was ontological. Western metaphysics, beginning with Plato and intensifying through Christian theology and modern technology, had forgotten being itself in favor of beings, had covered over the mystery and the question in favor of a calculative relationship to things. Modern technology, with its drive to enframe everything as standing reserve, as resources to be manipulated and controlled, represented the culmination of this forgetting. What was needed was not better metaphysics, but a step back from metaphysics entirely, a letting be that could allow being to show itself anew. Both men, in different ways, were also responding to the particular intensity of German philosophical and psychological culture. Germany, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was the center of psychiatric innovation. Kraepelin's classification system, Bleuler's work on schizophrenia, Freud's psychoanalysis. It was also the center of phenomenology and existential philosophy. Husserl, Scheler, Jaspers. There was a sense that German thought had a special depth, a special access to the fundamental questions that more superficial Anglo-American empiricism missed. This could shade into nationalism and claims of cultural superiority, something both Jung and Heidegger have been accused of, and not without reason. The question of German identity and German destiny haunted both men. For Jung, his Swiss identity gave him a certain distance from German nationalism, yet he was deeply embedded in German-speaking culture, published primarily in German, drew most of his intellectual heritage from German philosophy and psychology. His controversial statements during the Nazi period about differences between Germanic and Jewish psychology, his acceptance of the presidency of the German Psychotherapy Organization after Jewish members were expelled, these represent Jung at his worst, attempting to navigate an impossible situation but making moral compromises that rightly trouble us. For Heidegger, the question of German destiny was more explicitly central. In his Nazi period speeches and writings, he wrote of Germany as having a special mission of the German language as particularly suited to the question of being, of the German university as the site where being's truth might be preserved against the nihilism of modernity. Even after the war, Heidegger continued to believe that German thought had special access to being. This is not merely nationalism, but is bound up with problematic assumptions about cultural and linguistic essentialism that we must critically examine. Yet even as we name these failures and limitations, we can recognize that both men were grappling with real questions about meaning in a disenchanted world, about the relationship between individual and collective existence, about what authenticity might mean, about whether modernity's progressive loss of connection to deeper sources of meaning could be addressed. Their answers were partial, flawed, sometimes dangerously mistaken, but the questions remain. As the 1920s gave way to the 30s, Jung was increasingly focused on the process of individuation, on understanding how the psyche naturally moves toward wholeness if consciousness can cooperate with the unconscious. His studies of alchemy gave him a symbolic language for this process, the opus, the work of transformation, in which base material is refined into gold, in which multiplicity is reduced to unity, in which death and rebirth occur in the sealed vessel of the psyche. He saw in alchemical images the coniunctio, or sacred marriage of opposites, the figure of Mercurius, who is both spiritual and material, the philosopher's stone that is both the goal and the agent of transformation, a parallel to the psychological process his patients underwent. Jung's approach was fundamentally symbolic. Every image, every dream figure, every symptom contained meaning that could be unpacked through amplification by exploring the mythological, religious, and cultural parallels to the symbols that emerged from the unconscious. The psyche, for Jung, spoke in the language of images, and these images connected the individual to the collective patterns of human experience. Healing occurred not through rational insight alone, but through encountering these images, engaging with them in active imagination, allowing them to transform consciousness. Heidegger, meanwhile, was moving away from the existential analysis of being and time toward a more meditative, poetic mode of thinking. His later writings on art, on poetry, on technology, and dwelling were less systematic, more evocative. He wrote about Van Gogh's painting of peasant shoes as revealing the world of the peasant woman who wore them, as unconcealing earth and world in their strife. He wrote about Hölderlin's poetry as naming the holy, as bringing the gods near. He wrote about dwelling as requiring care, as needing a relationship to earth and sky, mortals and divinities, not as mere poetic metaphors, but as indicating a more original mode of being that modernity's homelessness had lost. Language became increasingly central to Heidegger's later thought, but not language as a tool for communication, not language as representing objects, rather, language as the house of being, as that within which being can show itself, as possessing its own power beyond human control. Humans do not so much use language as dwell within it, and in authentic speaking or hearing, being. Its self comes to presence. This is particularly true in poetry, where language is freed from its purely instrumental use and can sing, can name what is, can let things be in their being. There is something in Heidegger's later emphasis on language, on letting be, on releasement, Gelassenheit, a kind of non-willing openness to what is that resonates with Jung's emphasis on allowing the unconscious to speak, on receiving rather than forcing, on the attitude of symbolic awareness that can hold the tension of opposites without collapsing into one side. Both men, in their mature work, were advocating for a mode of awareness that is receptive rather than aggressive, that allows depth to manifest rather than imposing rational structures upon it. Yet the difference in their projects remains fundamental. Jung was a therapist. His goal was healing, helping individuals move through suffering toward greater wholeness, integrating unconscious contents that were split off and causing symptoms. The measure of success was psychological well-being, the ability to live creatively with the tensions and paradoxes of existence, the establishment of a living relationship between ego and self. Heidegger was a philosopher. His goal was truth about being, or rather, the unconcealment of being, the clearing of a space in which being could show itself. He was not concerned with psychological health or personal integration, but with the ontological question, with recovering a mode of thinking that was not metaphysical, with preparing for a possible future in which being might grant itself anew to thought after the long night of its forgetting. These are different enterprises, and yet they intersect at the level of human depth, of what lies beneath surface existence, of the call to authenticity that both men heard and tried to articulate. Consider the structure of existence that Heidegger called Dasein, and the structure Jung called the self. For Heidegger, Dasein is not a psychological subject, but the being who understands, being whose being is an issue for it, who exists as possibility, who is always already in the world. Dasein is characterized by existence. It is not a what, but a who, defined not by properties, but by the fact that its being is at stake, that it must take a stand on its own existence. This is a philosophical, ontological analysis, not a psychological description. Jung's self is the center and totality of the psyche, the archetype of wholeness, the goal of individuation. The self is both what one already is in potential and what one becomes through the individuation process. It encompasses consciousness and the unconscious, ego and shadow, the known and the unknown. Dreams and visions of the self often take the form of mandalas, quaternity symbols, divine figures, representations of centered wholeness. Are these the same reality approached from different angles, philosophy versus psychology? There is a temptation to harmonize them, to say that Dasein's existential structure is the ontological reality that Jung's psychology describes in symbolic terms. Both involve a relationship between what one currently is and one's authentic possibility. Both involve a movement from inauthentic, dispersed existence, Heidegger's Das Man, Jung's identification with persona or inflation by archetypal contents, toward authenticity or individuation. But the differences matter. Dasein, for Heidegger, is fundamentally temporal and historical, thrown into a particular world, projecting possibilities within that horizon. There is no transpersonal dimension to Dasein in Heidegger's analysis. Each Dasein is radically individualized by death, by the ownmost possibility that cannot be delegated to others. Dasein is finite, historical, mortal. There is no collective unconscious underlying Dasein, no archetypal pattern structuring its existence. Jung's self, by contrast, is both personal and transpersonal. The self is rooted in the collective unconscious, expressing itself through archetypal patterns that transcend the individual. The self in one person partakes of the same archetypal reality as the self in another person. Individuation is about becoming uniquely oneself, but it is also about recognizing one's connection to the collective patterns of human experience, to the archetypes that structure consciousness across cultures and epochs. Heidegger would likely see Jung's self as still too metaphysical, still positing an entity or structure where what is needed is an understanding of being's temporal unfolding. Jung would likely see Heidegger's analysis of Dasein as too abstract, too removed from the living reality of psychic images and symbols, too philosophical to capture the actual experience of encountering the self in dreams and active imagination. Yet both are pointing to a dimension of human existence that exceeds the conscious ego, that calls the ego beyond its current limitations, that involves a kind of depth or authenticity that most people most of the time avoid. The question of anxiety reveals both convergence and divergence. For Heidegger, anxiety, angst, is ontologically revelatory. In anxiety, the everyday world of significance and relevance falls away. The things that normally matter suddenly don't matter. Dasein is confronted with the nothing not a metaphysical void, but the experience of meaninglessness, of possibilities collapsing, of the familiar becoming uncanny. This is terrifying, but it is also liberating. In anxiety, Dasein is individualized, pulled out of its absorption in the they, confronted with its own freedom and its own responsibility for choosing how to be. Anxiety, for Heidegger, discloses Dasein's being in the world as such. Normally, Dasein is absorbed in particular projects, using particular things, pursuing particular goals. Anxiety reveals the whole structure of being in the world, the fact that Dasein is always already thrown into a world. It didn't choose, that it must project possibilities, that these possibilities are finite, that death looms as the ultimate limit. Authentic existence involves not fleeing from anxiety, but holding oneself open to it, allowing it to individualize and free Dasein from the tyranny of the they. This doesn't mean living in constant anxiety, but rather having undergone the experience of anxiety and having been transformed by it, having taken up one's existence as one's own rather than living according to what one does. For Jung, anxiety is also significant but understood quite differently. Anxiety might signal the emergence of unconscious contents that consciousness is not ready to integrate. It might arise from the confrontation with the shadow, with those aspects of oneself that one has repressed or denied. It might signal the encounter with an archetypal power, with the anima or animus, with the Great Mother in her terrible aspect, with the self in its overwhelming numinosity. Jung would understand anxiety less as revealing the structure of existence and more as indicating a disequilibrium in the psyche, a conflict between conscious and unconscious, a need for integration. The therapeutic response to anxiety is not simply to endure it as revelatory, though that may be part of the process, but to explore what unconscious contents are pressing forward, to work with dreams and symbols, to engage in active imagination, to gradually integrate what was split off. Jung might say that Heidegger's emphasis on anxiety as revealing Dasein's existential structure is itself a one-sided, overly philosophical approach that misses the specific archetypal dynamics at play. When someone experiences anxiety, it's not just about their finitude or their thrownness into being. It might be about a particular complex being activated, a particular archetypal pattern demanding recognition, a particular stage of the individuation process being negotiated. Heidegger might respond that Jung's interpretation psychologizes what is actually ontological, reducing the existential disclosure that occurs in anxiety to psychological mechanisms and structures. The question is not what particular contents are pressing forward, but the fact of Dasein's existence as such, its being toward death, its finitude, its responsibility. Yet perhaps anxiety can be both existential and psychological, can reveal both the structure of human existence and the specific dynamics of an individual psyche. Perhaps the person experiencing anxiety is encountering their finitude and their shadow, their thrownness and their repressed anima, their being toward death, and the archetypal self that demands ego's surrender. The question of death is particularly illuminating. For Heidegger, being toward death is constitutive of Dasein's existence. Dasein exists as finite. Death is not an event in the future, but a structural feature of existence. Dasein is always dying, always finite, always bounded by the limit it cannot cross. To anticipate death authentically is not to think about dying as a future event, but to take up one's existence with full awareness of its finitude, to recognize that one's possibilities are not infinite, that each choice forecloses other choices, that time is limited. This anticipation of death individualizes Dasein. No one can die my death for me. Death is the one possibility that cannot be delegated, cannot be shared. In facing death authentically, Dasein is pulled out of the they, which covers over death with idle talk and public norms, and is confronted with its own most non-relational, unsurpassable possibility. Jung's relationship to death is more ambiguous. On one hand, Jung took seriously the reports of near-death experiences, the universality of beliefs in an afterlife, the fact that the psyche seems to prepare for death in the dreams of the dying. He suggested that the psyche behaves as if it continues beyond death, not as proof of literal survival, but as a psychological fact that must be honored. The archetype of death and rebirth appears throughout Jung's work in alchemical imagery, in myths of the hero's descent and return, in the individuation process itself as a series of deaths and renewals. On the other hand, Jung approached death more therapeutically than existentially. He was concerned with how fear of death produces neurosis, how the denial of death prevents people from living fully, how the acceptance of mortality is necessary for psychological health. But he didn't make death central to the structure of the psyche in the way Heidegger made it central to Dasein. One could argue that Jung's emphasis on the self, particularly the experiences of the self reported by people near death, represents a kind of covering over of death's finality, a softening of the radical limit that Heidegger insists we must face. From a Heideggerian perspective, Jung's suggestions about the psyche continuing beyond death might be a flight from authentic being toward death, a way of avoiding the full confrontation with finitude. From a Jungian perspective, Heidegger's insistence on death as unsurpassable limit might itself be a one-sided philosophical stance that ignores the psyche's own relationship to mortality, the archetypal patterns of death and renewal, the symbolic dimension where death is never merely literal, but always also transformation, the death of an old identity, the necessary prelude to rebirth. The tension here is between taking death absolutely seriously as the defining limit of existence, Heidegger, and recognizing death as symbolically multivalent, as participating in archetypal patterns of transformation, Jung. Perhaps both are necessary, neither fleeing death's finality nor reducing it to mere symbol, neither denying transformation nor forgetting mortality. Consider now the question of authenticity, which both thinkers valued but understood differently. For Heidegger, authenticity, Eigentlichkeit, means owning one's existence, taking responsibility for it, making choices based on one's own most possibility rather than on what the they dictates. The authentic person has undergone the experience of anxiety, has heard the call of conscience summoning them back from lostness and everydayness, has anticipated death, has achieved resoluteness. This is a formal structure, not a matter of content. Heidegger doesn't prescribe what choices an authentic person should make. Authenticity is about how one exists, the way one takes up one's possibilities, not about which specific possibilities one chooses. The authentic person might live a very conventional life by external standards, but they live it consciously, resolutely, taking responsibility for their choices rather than simply doing what one does. Inauthenticity is not a moral failing, but an existential mode that Dasein naturally falls into. We are always already immersed in the they, understanding ourselves in terms of social roles and norms. This is not avoidable and not wholly negative. The they provides the background against which individuality can emerge. But to remain merely in this mode, to never question it, to never take up one's existence as one's own, this is to miss the full reality of one's being. Jung's understanding of authenticity is similar but centered on the psyche rather than on existence as such. To be authentic, in Jungian terms, is to follow the individuation process, to become who one really is, rather than who others expect one to be or who the collective norms dictate. This involves differentiating oneself from identifications with persona, the social mask, integrating the shadow, the despised or rejected parts of oneself, encountering and integrating the contrasexual other, anima or animus, and ultimately establishing a conscious relationship with the self. Individuation requires consciousness to engage with the unconscious, to honor its demands, to allow transformation to occur. The individuated person has a certain wholeness, a capacity to contain opposites, a flexibility that comes from not being rigidly identified with any one position. They have found their own myth, their own symbolic framework that gives meaning to their existence and connects them to the larger patterns of human experience. Both Heidegger and Jung value a kind of going against the grain of conventional existence, a refusal to live merely according to collective norms, a taking up of one's own depths. Both see most people as living inauthentically most of the time, not as a moral judgment, but as a description of the normal human tendency to avoid difficulty, to seek comfort in conformity, to flee from the demands of genuine existence or individuation. But Heidegger's authenticity is more austere, more focused on the formal structure of owning one's finitude and possibility. Jung's authenticity is richer in content, more concerned with specific symbols and archetypal patterns, more oriented toward wholeness and meaning. Heidegger might say that Jung fills the formal structure with psychological content that is still too metaphysical. Jung might say that Heidegger's formal analysis, while profound, doesn't capture the living reality of the psyche's movement toward wholeness through symbol and image. There is also the question of the other person, of relationality. For Heidegger, being with Mitsein is a constitutive feature of Dasein. Dasein is always already in a world with others. But Heidegger's analysis of everyday being with emphasizes the leveling effect of the they, the way we understand ourselves and others in terms of public norms and social roles. Authentic being with involves allowing the other to be themselves, not trying to control or dominate, not reducing them to a role. Yet Heidegger's emphasis remains on individual Dasein, achieving authenticity through anticipating death, which is the non-relational possibility par excellence. There is a certain solitary quality to Heideggerian authenticity, even though Dasein is always with others. Jung's emphasis on individuation might seem equally individualistic, but the process involves encountering archetypal figures who represent both aspects of oneself and transpersonal realities. The anima, or animus, mediates between ego and unconscious, but also represents the contrasexual other, preparing consciousness for genuine relationship with actual others rather than projection-contaminated pseudo-relationship. The shadow work involves recognizing what one projects onto others. Individuation, while centered on the individual, ultimately connects the person more genuinely to others, to the community, to humanity. Jung also emphasized the psychological relationship between analyst and analysand as the container in which transformation occurs. The alchemical analogy of the vas hermeticum, the sealed vessel, applies to the therapeutic relationship itself. Both participants are transformed through the process. This is quite different from Heidegger's philosophical analysis, which doesn't involve such a relational dimension. Philosophy, for Heidegger, is a thinking that questions and listens, but not a therapeutic encounter. The question of language reveals another fascinating point of comparison. For Heidegger, language is the house of being. This is not metaphorical. Language is the medium within which being can show itself, can be unconcealed. But language has become degraded in modernity, reduced to a tool for information transfer, for calculation, for control. What is needed is a recovery of language's essential nature as the place where truth happens, where being comes to presence. Poetry represents this essential nature of language most clearly. In poetry, language is freed from its merely instrumental use. The poet names what is, lets things be in their being, opens the space within which truth can occur. Heidegger's readings of Hölderlin, Trakl, and Rilke explore how poetic language brings forth world, how it names the holy, how it makes possible a dwelling that technological modernity has destroyed. Even ordinary language, when used authentically, can allow being to show itself. This requires a certain listening, a certain openness, a willingness to let words say what they say rather than forcing them into predetermined categories. Heidegger's own philosophical language is notoriously difficult precisely because he is trying to let language speak in new ways. To break free of the metaphysical framework that has determined traditional philosophical terminology, Jung also recognized the power of language, particularly symbolic language. But for Jung, the most important language is the language of the unconscious, the language of dreams, myths, symbols. This is not primarily verbal language, but image language, the language of the imagination. Words matter insofar as they carry symbolic weight, insofar as they point to or participate in archetypal realities. Jung's own writing style, particularly in his later works, often has a spiral quality, circling around symbols, amplifying them through mythological and alchemical parallels, allowing the symbolic reality to reveal itself through accumulated associations rather than through logical definition. He's trying to let the symbol speak, to honor its autonomy, not to reduce it to a merely rational formulation. For Jung, the symbol is alive. It cannot be fully translated into rational language without losing its power. The symbol mediates between consciousness and the unconscious, carrying meanings that are partly known and partly unknown. When a symbol is merely a sign, when we know exactly what it means, can define it precisely, it has died as a symbol. Living symbols are always partially opaque, always pointing beyond themselves to something numinous. Heidegger might appreciate Jung's emphasis on the autonomous power of symbols, the way they reveal rather than being merely constructed. But he would likely resist the psychologization of this process, the framing of symbol as mediating between conscious and unconscious. For Heidegger, what is at stake is not primarily the structure of the psyche, but the truth of being, the unconcealment that occurs in language and art. Jung might respond that Heidegger's emphasis on being remains too abstract, too removed from the actual experience of encountering numinous realities through images and symbols. The question of being is important, but for most people, the encounter with depth occurs through dreams, through synchronicities, through falling in love, through crises and transitions, all of which have specific symbolic forms that Jung's psychology can help interpret. There is a parallel worth exploring between Heidegger's critique of metaphysics and Jung's relationship to religious traditions. Heidegger argued that Western metaphysics, from Plato onward, forgot being in favor of beings. Metaphysics asks what things are, what properties they have, what causes them, what ground or foundation supports them. But it doesn't ask the more fundamental question, what does it mean to be at all? Why is there something rather than nothing? Metaphysics takes being for granted, uses it as a background concept without thematizing it. Moreover, metaphysics tends to ground beings in some ultimate being, the Platonic forms, the Christian God, the Cartesian thinking subject, the Hegelian absolute. This onto-theological structure of metaphysics covers over being itself by reducing it to a highest being, a ground or cause. What is needed is not a better metaphysics, but a step back from metaphysics entirely, a thinking that can let being be without reducing it to beings or grounding it in a highest being. Jung's relationship to religion is more ambiguous. On one hand, Jung was deeply interested in religious experience and saw religious symbols and myths as expressions of archetypal realities. He took religion seriously as a psychological phenomenon, not reducing it to illusion or neurosis as Freud had. God images, for Jung, are symbols of the self, the totality and center of the psyche. When people have religious experiences, they are encountering archetypal powers from the collective unconscious. On the other hand, Jung was often cagey about metaphysical claims. He famously said in a television interview, when asked if he believed in God, "I don't believe, I know," suggesting direct experience rather than faith. But he also insisted that psychology, as an empirical science, could only speak about psychic realities, about God images and religious symbols as psychological phenomena, not about whether God exists metaphysically, independently of the psyche. Yet Jung's psychology is itself a kind of metaphysics, a vision of the psyche as structured by archetypes, as containing a pensive, collective layer that transcends the individual, as oriented toward wholeness symbolized by the self. Jung sometimes wrote as if the psyche were the only reality we can know, as if the distinction between psychic and metaphysical reality were itself problematic. From a Heideggerian perspective, Jung's archetypal psychology might still be too metaphysical, still positing structures and entities archetypes, the collective unconscious, the self, where what is needed is a more fundamental questioning. The archetypes, Jung says, are patterns that structure experience, that manifest in symbols across cultures. But what is their mode of being? Are they like Platonic forms, eternal structures existing independently? Or are they themselves historically shaped, contingent, subject to transformation? Jung sometimes seemed to claim a kind of eternal status for the archetypes, seeing the same patterns recurring across all times and places. This would be metaphysical in Heidegger's sense, positing transcendent structures that ground and explain particular phenomena. Heidegger would insist on the historicity of all understanding, including our understanding of the psyche. There is no ahistorical access to archetypes or to anything else. Jung might respond that the archetypes are not metaphysical entities, but empirical realities observed in dreams, myths, and therapeutic practice. They are the psyche's structures as revealed through phenomenological observation. Whether they exist in themselves apart from experience is not a question psychology can answer, but their effects are undeniable. This touches on a fundamental difference in method. Heidegger's phenomenology is ontological, concerned with the being of beings, with uncovering the structures that make experience possible, with interpreting the meaning of being. Jung's method is empirical and interpretive, observing psychological phenomena, dreams, symptoms, myths, identifying recurring patterns, and interpreting their meaning through amplification and symbolic analysis. Heidegger does not work with patients, does not interpret dreams, does not offer therapy. His thinking is meditative, questioning, attentive to language and being. Jung does work with patients, does interpret dreams, does offer a path of healing and individuation. The proof of Jungian concepts is partly in their therapeutic efficacy, in whether they help people understand their suffering and move toward wholeness. Can these methods be integrated? Could one practice Jungian analysis while holding a Heideggerian understanding of existence? Perhaps. The analyst might understand the dreams and symbols that emerge in analysis as both psychologically significant revealing complexes, archetypal patterns, stages of individuation, and existentially significant, revealing the analysand's thrownness, their flight from authenticity, their being toward death, their possibilities for resoluteness. Anxiety in analysis might be understood both as indicating psychological conflict and as revealing existential structure. The self that appears in dreams might be understood both as the archetype of wholeness and as symbolizing Dasein's ownmost possibility, its call to authenticity. The process of individuation might be seen as the psychological dimension of the movement from inauthenticity to authenticity, but tensions would remain. Jung's emphasis on the goal of individuation, on the self as telos, might seem to Heidegger too much like imposing a metaphysical structure on existence, determining in advance what Dasein's being should be. Heidegger's insistence on radical finitude and the nothing might seem to Jung too negative, too dismissive of the psyche's inherent movement toward meaning and wholeness. There is also the question of the collective. Heidegger writes of the they, the anonymous public, das Man, as the mode in which Dasein ordinarily exists, understanding itself in terms of what one does, fleeing its individuality into conformity. This is mostly negative in Heidegger's analysis. The they levels down possibilities, covers over anxiety and death, prevents authentic existence. Though Heidegger acknowledges that being with is unavoidable and has positive dimensions, his emphasis is on the individual Dasein, achieving authenticity despite or against the they. Jung's collective unconscious is quite different. It is not a sociological phenomenon like the they, but an archetypal layer of the psyche, containing the inherited patterns that structure human experience. The collective unconscious is not something to escape or transcend, but something to encounter and integrate. Individuation involves both differentiating oneself from collective identifications, persona, conventional roles, and connecting consciously to the collective archetypal depths. For Jung, there is something numinous and valuable in the collective, when encountered in its archetypal form rather than as mere social convention. The myths, symbols, and rituals of human cultures across time give expression to the collective unconscious, providing pathways by which individuals can connect to transpersonal meaning. Modernity's loss of living myth is a psychological catastrophe because it cuts individuals off from these collective sources of meaning. Heidegger's attitude toward tradition and culture is more ambivalent. On one hand, he values pre-modern modes of existence, particularly the rooted dwelling of peasant life, the original thinking of the pre-Socratics, the naming power of great poetry. On the other hand, he insists that tradition often functions as a way of avoiding genuine thinking, of taking over handed-down concepts without questioning them. Authentic existence requires taking up tradition consciously, retrieving its genuine possibilities rather than simply repeating it. Both thinkers are concerned with the problem of how the individual relates to the collective heritage of meaning. But Jung sees the collective unconscious as an inner depth to be accessed, while Heidegger sees tradition as a historical inheritance to be questioned and retrieved. Jung's emphasis is more psychological and archetypal, Heidegger's more historical and existential. Let us consider how each thinker might approach a specific case, a hypothetical person in the midst of a life crisis. Imagine a middle-aged professional, successful by conventional standards, who begins to experience panic attacks, insomnia, and a growing sense that their life is empty and meaningless. They cannot name what is wrong. Outwardly, everything is fine. Inwardly, they feel they are dying, or that they have never truly lived. A Jungian analyst would listen to their dreams. Perhaps the dreams show their house on fire, or a dark figure pursuing them, or being lost in a labyrinth, or finding a mysterious child in an abandoned garden. The analyst would explore these images, amplifying them through mythological parallels, identifying archetypal patterns. The house on fire might represent the ego structure breaking down, the psyche dismantling a life that has become too narrow. The pursuing shadow figure might represent rejected aspects of the self-demanding integration. The mysterious child might be a symbol of new life, of potential not yet realized. The analyst would help the client engage in active imagination with these figures, dialoguing with the shadow, tending to the child. They would explore what this person has sacrificed for success, what unlived life remains in the unconscious. Perhaps they have been overly identified with a persona, with social roles and expectations, losing connection to their true nature. Perhaps the anima or animus is constellated, demanding that they value dimensions of experience they have dismissed as impractical or weak. The crisis would be understood as the psyche's demand for transformation, for a more whole mode of existence. The symptoms are not merely problems to be eliminated, but communications from the unconscious, signs that the individuation process is trying to move forward. The therapeutic work would involve helping this person develop a more conscious relationship with the unconscious, finding symbols and practices that give meaning, allowing a new myth to emerge that can carry them through the second half of life. A Heideggerian analysis would be quite different, though perhaps complementary. The anxiety this person experiences would be understood as potentially authentic anxiety, the mood in which the meaninglessness of everyday life is revealed. All the things this person has pursued, success, status, security, have suddenly lost their significance. The comfortable familiarity of the world has become uncanny. This is Dasein, confronting the nothing, the collapse of all everyday meanings. The therapeutic question, if Heidegger were doing therapy, which he wouldn't, would be whether the person can hear the call of conscience summoning them back from their lostness in the play. They back from living according to what one does. Can they take up their existence as their own? Can they achieve resoluteness, not by resolving to do this or that, but by fundamentally taking responsibility for their existence? The Heideggerian approach would emphasize finitude, mortality, the fact that this person's time is limited and they have been living inauthentically, absorbed in projects that were never truly their own. The panic and insomnia might signal Dasein's confrontation with being toward death, the radical limit that cannot be escaped or delegated. Rather than medicating or analyzing away the anxiety, the question would be whether this person can hold themselves open to it, can let it individualize them, can find their own most possibility. There is no talk of archetypes or symbols in this framework, no emphasis on dreams or active imagination. The focus is on existence itself, on finitude, on choice, on owning up to one's thrownness while projecting possibilities that are authentically one's own. The goal is not psychological wholeness, but existential authenticity, taking up one's being in the world resolutely rather than fleeing into conformity or distraction. Which approach is more helpful? Perhaps both have something to offer. The Jungian approach provides rich, symbolic resources, a sense that the psyche itself is guiding the process, specific practices for engaging with the unconscious. It honors the imaginal dimension, the power of images to transform consciousness. It suggests that meaning can be found, that wholeness is possible, that the crisis is purposeful. The Heideggerian approach provides existential clarity about finitude, authenticity, and responsibility. It refuses the comfort of symbols or archetypes if these become a way of avoiding the stark fact of one's existence. It insists on facing death, on recognizing one's radical freedom and responsibility, on not relying on structures or patterns that might themselves be inauthentic takeovers from tradition. Perhaps the most honest approach would combine both, using Jungian tools for working with the psyche's symbolic language, while maintaining Heideggerian awareness of existential structures, finitude, and the ever-present danger of inauthenticity. The dreams matter, and they reveal archetypal patterns, and these patterns must be understood in their existential significance, not as escape from existence, but as the psyche's way of mediating existential truths. Let us now consider the phenomenon that Jung called synchronicity. Synchronicity is the acausal connecting principle, the meaningful coincidence that cannot be explained by causality but seems to reveal a deeper order, a correspondence between psyche and world. Jung noticed that when patients were going through significant transformations, external events would sometimes mirror internal psychological states in uncanny ways. A patient dreams of a golden scarab, and at that moment a rare scarab beetle appears at the window. Someone is thinking intensely of another person, and the phone rings with that person calling. Jung developed a theory that archetypes, when activated, can constellate not only internal psychic contents, but also external events, suggesting that psyche and matter are not as separate as Cartesian dualism assumes. At deep levels, particularly in the collective unconscious, there may be a psychophysical unity, a unus mundus in the language of alchemy, where the distinction between inner and outer does not yet apply. Synchronicity suggests that the psyche is not locked inside the skull but participates in a broader field of meaning. The archetypes are not merely psychological structures but patterns that organize reality itself at both psychological and physical levels. When consciousness approaches these archetypal depths, the boundary between subject and object becomes porous. How might Heidegger respond to Jung's synchronicity? On one hand, Heidegger's critique of Cartesian dualism, his insistence that Dasein is always already in the world rather than a subject facing objects, might resonate with Jung's intuition that psyche and world are more deeply connected than modern consciousness assumes. Heidegger's emphasis on being in the world as a primordial unity prior to the subject-object split points toward a non-dualistic understanding. On the other hand, Heidegger might resist Jung's explanatory apparatus, the talk of archetypes, constellating events, of a causal connecting principles, of the collective unconscious as a kind of realm or layer. This still sounds too metaphysical, too much like positing entities and forces to explain what occurs. For Heidegger, the wonder is not to be explained, but to be allowed, to be held open as mystery. Heidegger's later writings on the fourfold earth, sky, mortals, and divinities, and on the way, thing, bringing the fourfold into their gathering, suggest a non-causal mode of relatedness, where meaning emerges not through mechanical causality, but through correspondence, resonance, belonging together. This is not far from what Jung means by synchronicity, though Heidegger would express it in ontological rather than psychological terms. The bridge, in Heidegger's famous example, things by gathering the fourfold. It lets the earth be earth, the sky be sky, allows mortals to dwell, and grants the divinities their presencing. Things are not isolated objects, but nodes in a web of meaning, each gathering the world in its own way. This gathering is not causal in the modern sense, but is more like what pre-modern thought called correspondence. Perhaps synchronicity, from a Heideggerian perspective, is what happens when Dasein becomes open to these non-causal modes of relatedness, when the calculative thinking that dominates modernity gives way to meditative thinking that can perceive how things belong together in meaning rather than merely in cause and effect. Jung's emphasis on the meaningfulness of synchronistic events resonates with this. What matters is not explaining how they happen, but recognizing the meaning that appears in their occurrence. Yet the difference remains. Jung wants a theory, an account of synchronicity that can be articulated, researched, related to other aspects of analytical psychology. He posits the collective unconscious and the archetypes as the ground of synchronistic phenomena. Heidegger would resist this theorization, seeing it as the technological mindset trying to master even mystery, to turn even wonder into an object of explanation. For Heidegger, The appropriate response to the mysterious correspondences that occur is not theory, but thinking that lets them be, that doesn't rush to explanation, but dwells with the mystery. Poetic thinking, meditative thinking, can point to these correspondences without explaining them away, can preserve their uncanny character rather than domesticating them through theory. From a Jungian perspective, Heidegger's refusal to theorize might seem like a missed opportunity. If synchronicities occur, if they have patterns, if understanding those patterns can help people recognize when they are occurring and what they might mean, then surely some theoretical framework is useful. Jung's theory of synchronicity, even if provisional and incomplete, provides language and concepts that allow people to recognize and work with these experiences rather than simply dismissing them as coincidence. The tension here is between Jung's more systematic, explanatory approach and Heidegger's more meditative, questioning approach. Jung wants to build a psychology, a body of knowledge about the psyche that can be taught and applied. Heidegger wants to recover a mode of thinking that doesn't turn everything into objects of knowledge, but can let being be, can dwell in wonder and question. Both approaches have value, and their strengths are their limitations. Jung's systematic approach allows for teaching, for clinical practice, for helping people in concrete ways. But it risks reducing mystery to theory, turning the numinous into psychological mechanisms. Heidegger's meditative approach preserves wonder and mystery, refuses premature closure, but it offers less practical guidance, less that can be taught or applied, less that directly helps someone in crisis understand what is happening to them. Consider also the question of nature, of earth, of the more than human world. Jung's psychology is deeply anthropocentric. In one sense, it's about the human psyche, about human consciousness and the human collective unconscious. Yet Jung also recognized that the archetypes might not be limited to human consciousness. He speculated about the possibility of an anima mundi, a world soul, and about whether other animals might participate in archetypal patterns. Jung's interest in alchemy included attention to the alchemists' relationship with matter, their sense that spirit was hidden in matter, that the work of transformation involved both psyche and substance. The unus mundus, the unified world that alchemists believed underlay the apparent separation of mind and matter, suggested to Jung a deeper unity in which consciousness and nature were not fundamentally separate. But Jung's focus remained on the human psyche. Even when he wrote about the cosmic dimensions of the self, he was primarily concerned with how human consciousness relates to these depths, how individuals can integrate archetypal contents, how the individuation process unfolds in human lives. Heidegger's later thinking gives more emphasis to earth, to nature, though not in a straightforwardly ecological sense. Earth, for Heidegger, is one dimension of the fourfold, along with sky, mortals, and divinities. Earth is the self-secluding, the ground that supports but also withdraws, that cannot be fully mastered or revealed. Modern technology attempts to reduce Earth to standing reserve, to resources for exploitation, treating nature as mere material for human projects. Authentic dwelling, for Heidegger, requires preserving Earth as Earth, not reducing it to resource, allowing it its self-secluding mystery. The peasant farmhouse that Heidegger admired rested on the earth without dominating it, gathered the fourfold in its simple dwelling. This is not environmentalism in the contemporary sense, but a more fundamental recognition of Earth's resistance to total illumination and control. There is something in Heidegger's attitude toward nature that Jung might appreciate the sense that mystery must be preserved, that not everything should be brought to light, that the depths must be allowed their concealment. Jung often warned against too much consciousness, against the dangers of inflation, against trying to integrate all of the unconscious. Some things must remain unconscious. The self has a dark side, a deus absconditus, a hidden God who cannot be fully known. Both thinkers, in different ways, resist modernity's drive toward total enlightenment, total control, total clarity. Both value darkness, depth, mystery, hiddenness. Both see danger in the attempt to illuminate everything, to reduce all reality to objects of consciousness or manipulation. For Jung, this takes the form of honoring the autonomous reality of the unconscious, not trying to make everything conscious, recognizing that the self exceeds the ego's grasp. For Heidegger, it takes the form of letting earth be earth, of recognizing that being withdraws even as it reveals itself, that the mystery cannot be eliminated without destroying what matters most. The question of technology and modernity reveals another convergence. Jung was deeply concerned about the loss of living religious symbols in modernity, the disenchantment of the world, the reduction of everything to rational calculation. He saw this as producing a crisis of meaning, leaving people cut off from the archetypal sources that had sustained humanity for millennia. Neurosis, for Jung, was often the result of this loss of connection to the symbolic life. Jung worried about mass movements, about the way individuals could be possessed by archetypal forces when these forces were not consciously integrated. The rise of Nazism, which Jung witnessed with horror and occasionally with troubling ambiguity, represented for him the eruption of the collective unconscious, in destructive form the archetype of Wotan, the old Germanic god of storm and frenzy, possessing the German people, producing mass psychosis. The solution, for Jung, was individual consciousness, individual integration of archetypal contents, individual differentiation from collective identifications. If enough individuals underwent the individuation process, perhaps they would be less susceptible to mass possession, less likely to project their shadows onto others, more capable of containing the tensions and paradoxes of existence without resorting to violence. Heidegger's critique of modernity focused on technology and metaphysics. Technology, in Heidegger's sense, is not merely machines, but a way of relating to reality as standing reserve, as resources to be ordered and controlled. Modern science, modern industry, modern bureaucracy, all of these treat reality as something to be mastered, calculated, exploited for human purposes. This technological enframing, Gestalt, is the culmination of Western metaphysics' forgetfulness of being. The danger of technology is not that this or that machine might go wrong, but that the technological way of relating to reality becomes total, reducing everything, including humans themselves, to standing reserve. When humans are treated as human resources, when nature is treated as energy reserves, when thinking itself becomes calculation, then we have lost the capacity for authentic dwelling, for letting things be, for experiencing wonder. Heidegger's response was not political action or technological reform, but a turning, K-ray, a transformation in thinking itself. What is needed is to step back from the technological attitude, to recover a more meditative relation to being, to allow things to presence without immediately grasping and controlling them. This might be prepared by poets, by thinkers, by those who can preserve the memory of other ways of being, but it cannot be forced or planned. It requires waiting, releasement, Gelassenheit, openness to the possibility that being might grant itself anew. Both Jung and Heidegger then see modernity as involving a profound loss, a forgetting or cutting off from depths that must be recovered. For Jung, the loss is of living connection to the archetypal symbolic life. For Heidegger, the loss is of the question of being itself, covered over by metaphysics and technological enframing. Both see individual, consciousness, and authenticity as part of the response, though neither believes that individual effort alone is sufficient. The tragic dimension of both thinkers' work is the recognition that the crisis is vast, that the forces of modernity are powerful, that recovery or transformation may not occur. Jung worried that humanity might destroy itself, that the projection of the shadow in warfare and totalitarianism might lead to annihilation. Heidegger worried that technological enframing might become total, that being might withdraw entirely, that the planetary domination of technology might leave no space for genuine dwelling. Yet both also maintain a kind of hope, or at least openness to possibility. Jung believed that the psyche has its own wisdom, that the individuation process is a natural tendency that will reassert itself if given the chance. Even in dark times, individuals can undergo transformation, can find meaning, can establish conscious relationship with the depths. These individual transformations matter, even if the collective situation remains dire. Heidegger's later writings suggest a kind of waiting, a preparing for a possible turning when being might grant itself anew. He wrote of the necessity of dwelling in the time of need, of preserving the memory of being's question, of learning to wait without despair. The transformation cannot be willed or planned, but it can be prepared for through thinking that is open, meditative, released from the drive to control. In both thinkers, there is a paradoxical attitude toward action. Both emphasize consciousness, awareness, thinking which might seem passive, yet both also insist on a kind of radical responsibility. For Jung, the individual is responsible for becoming conscious, for doing the hard work of integration, for not inflating or projecting. For Heidegger, Dasein is responsible for taking up its existence authentically, for achieving resoluteness, for not fleeing into the they. This responsibility is not simply a matter of choices within the world, but of how one fundamentally exists, how one relates to the depths, whether psychological or ontological. The work required is inner transformation, change in consciousness or in one's mode of being, not merely outward action. Yet this inner transformation has outward consequences, shaping how one lives, how one relates to others, what one values and pursues. Let us return now to the central concepts and explore them more deeply. Heidegger's concept of being is notoriously difficult to grasp. Being is not a being, not any particular entity, nor is it a property that all beings share. It is not the sum of all beings, nor some being that exists behind or above them. Yet all beings are, they have being. What does this mean? Heidegger suggests that we understand being most fundamentally as presencing, as coming to presence, as the event of unconcealment in which beings show themselves. Being is verbal rather than nominal, not a thing, but an occurrence, a happening. When we encounter a tree, the tree presents itself to us, comes into the clearing of our awareness. This presencing is being, not the tree as an object, but the event of the tree's manifestation, its being there, its showing itself. The history of Western metaphysics, Heidegger argues, has increasingly forgotten being in this sense, treating it merely as a background concept, taking it for granted while focusing on particular beings and their properties, causes, and relations. What is needed is to recover the wonder of being, the strangeness that there are beings at all rather than nothing, the mystery that beings presence themselves come into unconcealment. Jung's concept of the self has a different character but shares something of this quality of being both fundamental and elusive. The self is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious together, but it is also the center, the organizing principle, the archetype of wholeness. In experience, the self manifests through symbols of totality, mandalas, quaternity images, circles, divine figures representing completeness. The self is both what one already is, in potential, and what one becomes through the individuation process. It is larger than the ego, encompasses the ego but is not identical to it. The ego is the center of consciousness. The self is the center of the total psyche. Establishing a conscious relationship between ego and self is the goal of individuation. Is there any way to bridge these concepts? Both Heidegger's being and Jung's self point to something foundational that is not itself a being or entity, something that grounds or structures experience without being simply an object of experience. Both are described through paradox. Being is and is not. The self is both center and totality, both personal and transpersonal, but the differences are equally important. Being, for Heidegger, is ontological, not psychological. It is not a structure of the psyche, but the ground of all beings, including the psyche itself. The self, for Jung, is psychological, an archetype within the collective unconscious, manifesting through symbols that affect consciousness. One could argue that Jung's self is an image of being, a way that being manifests itself within the psyche. When someone encounters the self in dreams or active imagination, they are encountering their own depths, but perhaps those depths are not merely personal or even collectively human, but open onto being itself. The numinosity of self-images, their quality of absolute otherness combined with intimate familiarity, might be the way being presents itself to psychological awareness. Heidegger might resist this, seeing it as psychologizing being, reducing the ontological question to psychological experience. But perhaps the resistance itself reveals a limitation. If being can only be approached through human existence, and Heidegger insists that the question of being must be approached through the analysis of design, then the psychological forms this approach takes are not irrelevant to ontology. The symbols through which people experience ultimacy, the dreams in which they encounter what feels most real, the transformations they undergo in facing their depths, these are not merely psychological facts, but ways that being manifests itself. From a Jungian perspective, Heidegger's being might be what Jung called the self in its most abstract philosophical formulation. But Jung would insist that being, when actually encountered, never appears as pure abstraction, but always as image, as symbol, as numinous presence, taking specific forms, the wise old man, the divine child, the mandala, the conjunctio. Philosophy can analyze the structure of existence, but the living encounter requires the mediation of symbol. The question of mediation is crucial here. For Heidegger, particularly the later Heidegger, language is the medium through which being comes to presence. Poetic language, authentic thinking, can let being show itself without imposing categories that would cover it over. There is a directness here. Being speaks through language when language is released from its merely instrumental use. For Jung, symbol is the necessary medium between consciousness and the unconscious, between ego and self. The symbol participates in both realms, carries meanings from the unknown into the known. Without symbol, the encounter with the archetypal would be overwhelming, shattering, producing psychosis rather than transformation. Symbol mediates, allows gradual integration, makes the infinite bearable to finite consciousness. Heidegger might see this symbolic mediation as still too subject-oriented, as if consciousness were here and being were there, requiring a bridge. His insistence on being in the world suggests a more primordial unity that doesn't require mediation because there is no separation to overcome. But lived experience seems to bear out Jung's observation. The encounter with depths does come through images, does require symbolic forms, is devastating when it occurs without such mediation. Perhaps both are describing aspects of the same reality. The ontological structure, Heidegger, and the psychological dynamics, Jung, are not separate realities, but different dimensions or perspectives on human existence and its relationship to depth. One can analyze the structure of being in the world while also attending to how this structure manifests psychologically through symbols and transformative processes. Let us consider the experience of what might be called the sacred, the numinous, the divine. For Jung, such experiences are central to psychological health. The encounter with numinous archetypal contents, the awesome otherness of the self, the terrible power of the Great Mother, the mysterious presence of the divine child provides meaning and energy for life. Religious experiences are not illusions, but encounters with psychological realities that are more real, in a sense, than ego consciousness. Jung distinguished between religion as living encounter with the numinous and religion as creed, institution, dogma. Dogma, for Jung, originally arose as a protective form, a way of containing and mediating numinous experiences so they wouldn't shatter consciousness. The Christian dogma of the Trinity, for example, expresses and contains the archetype of the self in its threefold and fourfold aspects. But when dogma becomes merely belief, when it loses its connection to living experience, it dies and can no longer serve its protective function. Modern humanity's loss of living religion leaves people exposed to direct encounter with archetypal forces without the container that traditional religious forms provided. This is dangerous, potentially producing possession rather than integration. Yet it is also an opportunity for more conscious, individual relationship with the numinous, not mediated by collective institutions, but directly experienced and integrated through the individuation process. Heidegger's relationship to the divine is more ambiguous. In his early work, influenced by his Catholic background, he was interested in religious experience and the philosophy of religion. But Being and Time deliberately brackets the question of God, focusing on the existential structures of Dasein without invoking the divine. In his later work, particularly in his readings of Hölderlin, Heidegger writes of the gods and the holy, but in a way that is neither traditionally Christian nor simply pagan. The gods, for the later Heidegger, are those who belong to the fourfold, part of the gathering that occurs in authentic dwelling. But the gods have fled in modernity, leaving us in a time of destitution, in the time of the gods' default. Heidegger speaks of the need to prepare for a possible return of the gods, or for the last god one, who is neither the old gods nor the Christian God, but something yet to come. This is not theology in any conventional sense, but a meditation on the sacred as a dimension of being that modernity has lost access to, that can only be prepared for, not forced. There is something in Heidegger's sense of living in the time of destitution, waiting for the possible return of the gods, that resonates with Jung's concern about the loss of living religious symbols. Both see modernity as characterized by the absence or flight of the sacred. Both believe something is needed beyond rational thought or technological progress, some recovery of depth, some opening to what exceeds calculation and control. But Jung offers more specific practices: active imagination, dream work, attention to symbols, the individuation process. Heidegger offers primarily thinking, meditation, waiting, releasement. Jung's approach is more therapeutic, more practical, more immediately applicable to individual suffering. Heidegger's approach is more philosophical, more concerned with the collective historical situation, more open to the possibility that transformation might not occur or might take forms we cannot anticipate. From a Jungian perspective, Heidegger's later work on the gods and the holy might be understood as expressing in philosophical language the collective situation of humanity cut off from the self, from the numinous center, experiencing this as the withdrawal of the gods. The last god might be a new symbol of the self-appropriate to post-metaphysical consciousness, a new way that wholeness and meaning might manifest for humanity after the death of traditional religious forms. From a Heideggerian perspective, Jung's archetypal psychology might still be too anthropocentric, too focused on human consciousness and its needs, not sufficiently attentive to being's own movement, its own rhythms of concealment and unconcealment that are not organized around human psychological health or wholeness. Yet both are responding to the same crisis: the loss of meaning, the disenchantment of existence, the reduction of reality to objects of manipulation and control. And both insist that the response cannot be more of the same: more rationality, more technology, more progress. What is needed is a turning, a recovery of depth, a mode of existence or consciousness that can honor mystery, dwell with uncertainty, allow what withdraws to remain withdrawn, even as we attend to what presences. The theme of darkness and light runs through both thinkers' work, though differently inflected. For Heidegger, truth is aletheia, unconcealment, unhiddenness. But unconcealment always occurs against a background of concealment. To reveal something is also to hide something else. The light in which beings show themselves casts shadows. Being itself, even as it grants beings their presence, withdraws, remains hidden in its essence. Heidegger rejects the traditional correspondence theory of truth, truth as the agreement of intellect with reality, in favor of this more primordial notion of truth as unconcealment. But he insists that unconcealment is not total illumination. There is always a dimension of hiddenness, of mystery, of what does not show itself. The drive for complete clarity, complete light, complete knowledge is itself a form of violence against being, an attempt to force it into total presence. For Jung, too, consciousness is light, but it exists against the background of the unconscious, which is dark, hidden, autonomous. The goal of individuation is not to make everything conscious. That would be inflation, the ego's grandiose attempt to encompass the totality. Rather, the goal is to establish a conscious relationship with the unconscious, to allow what wants to become conscious to emerge while respecting what must remain unconscious. Jung wrote of the dark side of God, of the self's shadow aspect, of evil as not merely absence, of good but as real force that must be acknowledged. The quaternity that Jung saw as more complete than the Christian Trinity includes the fourth element, often associated with earth, matter, femininity, darkness, the devil dimensions that official Christianity excluded but that alchemy preserved in symbolic form. Both thinkers, then, resist the Enlightenment ideal of total illumination, total rational transparency. Both value darkness, mystery, what withdraws. Both see danger in the drive to make everything conscious, to illuminate everything, to reduce all reality to objects of clear and distinct knowledge. This is not obscurantism or irrationalism, but a recognition that reality exceeds our grasp, that consciousness is finite, that some forms of knowledge or relationship with depth require allowing hiddenness in its rights. The poetic, the symbolic, the meditative modes of awareness that both thinkers value are precisely those that can honor what does not show itself directly, what speaks through concealment rather than in full presence. There is a political dimension here as well, though both thinkers are ambiguous political figures. The totalitarian movements that scarred the 20th century, which both Jung and Heidegger lived through and were to varying degrees implicated in, represented in their different analyses a kind of inflation, a claim to total knowledge, total control, total transformation of reality according to rational plan. Jung saw Nazism as the eruption of archetypal forces that possessed the German people precisely because these forces had been repressed, not integrated consciously. The shadow side of German culture, its Wohltangent energy, its violence, its paganism, had been suppressed by Christianity and Enlightenment rationalism, only to erupt in monstrous form. If individuals and cultures integrated their shadows consciously, perhaps such mass possession would be less likely. Heidegger's relationship to Nazism was, tragically, more direct. His rectoral address, his brief Nazi Party membership, his conviction, later abandoned or transformed, that National Socialism might be a way to resist the leveling effects of technology and modernity. His later silence about this involvement, his failure to adequately apologize or explain, remains a scar on his legacy. Yet his later work on technology can be read as an indirect reckoning with totalitarianism, the technological mindset that reduces everything to standing reserve, that seeks total control, that imposes rational planning on reality. This is the essence of totalitarianism, whether in its Nazi, Soviet, or contemporary forms. The drive for total power, total knowledge, total transformation is itself the problem, born from metaphysics' forgetfulness of being, from the loss of releasement and dwelling. Both thinkers warn against the dangers of collective movements, mass identification, loss of individual consciousness or authenticity. Yet both also recognize that purely individual solutions are insufficient. Jung's individuation occurs within and for the sake of relationship to the collective. Heidegger's authenticity is always a possibility of Dasein, that is, being with others. The tension between individual and collective, between differentiation and participation, remains unresolved in both thinkers. Let us turn to the question of healing and transformation. For Jung, this is the central question: how does healing occur? What allows someone to move from neurosis to health, from fragmentation to wholeness, from unconsciousness to consciousness? The Jungian answer involves multiple dimensions. First, making the unconscious conscious through dream work, active imagination. exploring symptoms and projections, identifying complexes. This is analytic work, bringing to light what was hidden, understanding the meanings of symptoms, tracing complexes to their archetypal roots. Second, integrating the shadow, acknowledging and accepting those parts of oneself that have been rejected, repressed, projected onto others. Shadow work is difficult, humbling, requiring honesty about one's darkness, but it is essential for wholeness. Third, encountering and integrating the contrasexual other, the anima for men, the animus for women. This involves recognizing how one's relationship with the inner other has been projected onto external relationships, differentiating the archetypal from the personal. Fourth, the encounter with the self through dreams, visions, synchronicities, crisis experiences. The self appears as both numinous other and deepest self, both alien and most familiar. Establishing conscious relationship with the self involves ego's surrender of its claim to be the center, its acceptance of service to a larger wholeness. All of this occurs within the container of the therapeutic relationship, the alchemical vase, where both analyst and analysand undergo transformation. The analyst provides steady presence, interpretation, amplification of symbols, holding the space in which the process can unfold. But the analyst must also have done their own inner work, must remain conscious of their own complexes and projections, must allow themselves to be affected by the encounter. Healing, for Jung, is not cure in the sense of removal of symptoms, but transformation, a movement toward wholeness that includes rather than excludes suffering. The individuated person is not problem-free, but has greater capacity to contain tensions, to live with paradox, to find meaning in suffering. Heidegger does not offer a theory of healing because he is not doing therapy, but his existential analysis does suggest something about what authentic existence looks like, and perhaps what allows the movement from inauthenticity to authenticity. The movement occurs through anxiety, through the call of conscience, through anticipating death, through resoluteness, all of which involve a kind of crisis, a breaking down of everyday absorption in the they. Authenticity is not a permanent state, but a possibility that must be continually taken up. Dasein falls back into everydayness, must be called back again, must repeatedly choose to take up its existence as its own. This is not a process of gradual integration, but an existential decision, a mode of existing that can be achieved and lost. There is no container, no therapeutic relationship, no gradual working through of contents in Heidegger's analysis. There is only the individual Dasein confronting its existence, responding to the call of conscience, achieving resoluteness. This seems harsher, less supported, more austere than Jung's approach. Yet perhaps they are complementary. The existential structures Heidegger describes thrownness, being toward death, fallenness. Authenticity provide a framework within which Jung's therapeutic process can be understood more fundamentally. The person in therapy is Dasein confronting its existence and the psychological contents that emerge, dreams, complexes, archetypal images, are ways that this confrontation manifests. The shadow that Jung speaks of is partly what Heidegger might understand as the facticity of one's thrownness, the given, the already decided, the past that cannot be changed but must be owned. The encounter with death that is so central to Heidegger's analysis is both existential structure and psychological content, both the ontological fact of finitude and the archetypal experience of death and rebirth. The Jungian self and the Heideggerian authentic Dasein might both be pointing to what occurs when human existence no longer flees from its depths, but turns toward them, owns them, lives from them. Whether one describes this in psychological language, self, individuation, wholeness, or existential ontological language, authenticity, resoluteness, owning one's being toward death, may be less important than recognizing that both are describing a important transformation from dispersed, defended, inauthentic existence to centered, open, authentic being. There remains the question of meaning. For Jung, meaning is central to psychological health. Humans need meaning more than they need happiness. Neurosis often arises from loss of meaning, and healing involves finding or creating meaning that can sustain one through life's difficulties. This meaning comes from connection to archetypal depths, from discovering one's myth, from serving something larger than the ego. Jung's own life exemplified this. After his break with Freud, when he was lost in his confrontation with the unconscious, what sustained him was the sense that he was undergoing something meaningful, that the images and visions that threatened to overwhelm him were not mere pathology, but communications from depths that demanded attention. Finding ways to give form to these communications through the Red Book, through his stone carving, through the development of his psychology gave meaning to the suffering. Meaning, for Jung, is not something we invent, but something we discover or receive. The archetypes provide patterns of meaning that precede individual consciousness. The symbols that emerge from the unconscious carry meanings that exceed our understanding, but that resonate as true, as significant. To live meaningfully is to align oneself with these archetypal patterns, to find one's place in the larger story. For Heidegger, the question of meaning is complicated by his critique of traditional metaphysics' search for grounds and causes. In Being in Time, he analyzes the structures that make meaning possible, the temporal stretching out of Dasein, the projection of possibilities, the understanding of things in terms of their involvement in projects. Meaning arises from the web of relevances within which Dasein exists, the mattering that constitutes a world. But Heidegger insists that there is no ultimate ground, no metaphysical foundation that guarantees meaning. Dasein's possibilities are finite, bounded by death. The temptation is to flee into projects that promise ultimate meaning or security, religious dogma, political ideology, technological progress. But these are inauthentic takeovers from the they, ways of avoiding the anxiety that comes with recognizing that meaning is not given, but must be taken up, projected, lived. In his later work, Heidegger suggests that meaning comes from dwelling, from being appropriated by being, from responding to being's address. This is not meaning that the subject creates, but meaning that arises from attentiveness to being's presencing. The poet, the thinker, the one who truly dwells, these respond to what addresses them. Allow meaning to arise, rather than imposing it. There is convergence here between Heidegger's later emphasis on letting be, on responding to what addresses us, and Jung's emphasis on receiving symbols from the unconscious, on serving the self, rather than the ego's will. Both suggest that meaning is not something we generate through will or reason, but something we receive through opening ourselves to depths, psychological or ontological, that exceed our control. But there is also tension. Jung's archetypal patterns provide content, specific forms of meaning, the hero's journey, the sacred marriage, the wise old man, the quaternity. These recurring symbols across cultures suggest that there are universal patterns of meaning available to consciousness. Heidegger would likely see this as still too metaphysical, still positing eternal structures that transcend history and situation. For Heidegger, meaning is always historically situated, always arising within a particular world, a particular clearing of being. There are no eternal archetypes, only historical forms of meaning that arise and pass away. The meanings available to ancient Greeks were different from those available to medieval Christians, which are different from those available or unavailable to moderns. We cannot simply return to earlier forms of meaning. We must respond to being as it addresses us in our historical situation. From a Jungian perspective, Heidegger's emphasis on historical situatedness might miss the transhistorical patterns that recur across cultures and epochs. Yes, meaning takes different forms in different times, but the underlying archetypal patterns persist: the need for death and rebirth, for union of opposites, for journey and return. To deny these transhistorical patterns is to cut ourselves off from the deepest sources of meaning. The debate may be unresolvable, but perhaps both perspectives are needed. The archetypal patterns are real and provide continuity across history, yet they manifest differently in different historical situations and cannot be applied mechanically. The historical situatedness is real, and we cannot access meaning outside our historical horizon. Yet the recurring symbols and myths suggest that human existence has structures or patterns that transcend any particular epoch. Let us consider now the image of the journey, which appears in both thinkers' work, though in different forms. Jung often described individuation as a journey, the hero's journey into the depths, confronting dragons and finding treasure, descending to the underworld and returning transformed. This is both individual psychological process and universal archetypal pattern, enacted in myths and fairy tales across cultures. The journey involves leaving home, the familiar conscious position, encountering trials, shadow, anima, animus, archetypal powers, finding a treasure or achieving a goal, integration, contact with the self, and returning home, transformed conscious personality, now related to unconscious depths. The pattern gives shape to life's major transitions: adolescence, midlife crisis, approaching death, each requiring a journey into unknown territory and return with new understanding. Heidegger's phenomenology is also sometimes described as a way, a path of thinking. His later writings particularly emphasize this: we are underway, on the way, not arriving at final answers, but following the path where thinking leads. The image of the Holzwege woodland paths that lead nowhere in particular, that are not highways to destinations but ways of moving through the forest, dwelling in it, captures something of Heidegger's approach. But Heidegger is suspicious of the teleological structure of the hero's journey, the notion that there is a goal to be achieved, a treasure to be won. This still sounds like the metaphysical drive for completion, for presence, for having achieved something definite. For Heidegger, the way is not toward a goal, but is itself the matter, thinking as way-making, as opening paths, as dwelling in the questioning without arriving at final answers. There is something in Heidegger's emphasis on the way rather than the goal that challenges Jung's notion of the self as telos of individuation. If the self is the goal, the endpoint, the wholeness to be achieved, does this not impose a structure on existence that might be as restrictive as the metaphysical systems Heidegger critiques? Does it not suggest that we know in advance what authentic existence looks like? Jung might respond that the self is not a static goal, but a living process, that every experience of the self is partial, that the journey toward wholeness never ends, but continues through death and perhaps beyond. The self as symbol points toward completeness, but this completeness can never be finally grasped by the ego. The journey continues, deepens, spirals rather than arriving at a final endpoint. Perhaps the difference is partly temperamental. Heidegger's austere insistence on finitude, on dwelling in the question, on not seeking comfort in metaphysical guarantees, appeals to a certain philosophical sensibility. Jung's richer, symbolic landscape, his assurance that the psyche is fundamentally oriented toward wholeness, his therapeutic emphasis on meaning and integration, appeals to a different sensibility. But we need not choose one exclusively. The person undergoing analysis can benefit from Jung's symbolic resources while maintaining Heideggerian awareness of finitude and the dangers of metaphysical comfort. The philosopher can practice Heideggerian meditative thinking while recognizing that the psyche speaks in images and that these images are not merely subjective but reveal archetypal depths. As we move into the final dimension of our exploration, let us reflect on what the dialogue between Jung and Heidegger reveals about the human condition, about consciousness, about the possibility of authentic existence in a disenchanted age. Both thinkers responded to the crisis of modernity by turning to depths, psychological or ontological, that modernity had forgotten or denied. Both insisted that the rational, conscious, technological attitude cannot exhaust reality, that there are dimensions of existence that exceed calculation and control, that must be approached with different sensibilities, symbolic, meditative, receptive, rather than aggressive. Both emphasized the importance of facing what is difficult, what we would rather avoid. For Jung, this is the shadow, the rejected parts of ourselves, the numinous powers of the unconscious that threaten ego's mastery. For Heidegger, this is anxiety, death, the nothing that reveals the contingency of all meaning. Both believe that authentic existence requires not fleeing from these difficult truths, but turning toward them, allowing ourselves to be transformed by them. Both valued a kind of centered existence, Jung's individuation, Heidegger's authenticity, in which one lives from one's depths rather than from surface conventions or collective norms. Both saw most people as living inauthentically most of the time, not as moral failure, but as the normal human condition from which occasional moments of authenticity or consciousness emerge. Both believe that individual transformation matters, even if collective transformation seems unlikely. The individuated person, for Jung, serves the collective by not being possessed by collective unconsciousness, by providing a model of consciousness and integration. The authentic Dasein, for Heidegger, preserves the possibility of genuine existence even in the time of metaphysics' closure and technology's domination. But both also recognized that individual effort alone is not enough. Jung's individuation occurs within the container of relationship, supported by analyst, by living symbols, by connection to tradition and to others undergoing similar processes. Heidegger's authentic Dasein is being with others, exists in language which is communal, depends on the historical clearing of being which is not within individual control. There is a profound humility in both approaches, a recognition that we are not masters of our own depths, that consciousness or authenticity is not something we achieve through will, but something we receive or allow. Jung emphasized listening to the unconscious, serving the self, allowing transformation rather than forcing it. Heidegger emphasized releasement, letting be, responding to being's address rather than imposing our categories. This humility is especially important in an age that still dreams of total mastery, mastery of nature through technology, mastery of society through social engineering, mastery of consciousness through neuroscience or pharmaceutical intervention. Both Jung and Heidegger insist that such dreams of mastery are dangerous illusions, that reality exceeds our grasp, that the proper attitude is one of respect, care, attentiveness to what shows itself rather than forcing it into our frameworks. The question of evil and darkness takes on particular importance in light of the 20th century's horrors, which both thinkers lived through. Jung's insistence on integrating the shadow, on acknowledging evil as real, rather than merely as absence of good, provides resources for understanding how ordinary people become capable of monstrous acts. When the shadow is not integrated consciously, it becomes projected onto others, enacted unconsciously, possessed by archetypal forces beyond ego's control. The Nazi persecution of Jews, for Jung, represented a massive projection of the German shadow, all that was rejected and despised attributed to the other, who could then be attacked and destroyed. This is not to excuse or explain away the Holocaust, but to provide psychological insight into one dimension of how such evil became possible. Had individuals and the culture as a whole done more conscious shadow work, perhaps such collective possession would have been less likely. Heidegger's own involvement with Nazism complicates any simple application of his philosophy to questions of ethics and evil. Can one trust the ontological analysis of a philosopher who made such catastrophic political judgments? Yet perhaps Heidegger's tools are useful precisely for analyzing the failure, the flight into inauthentic collective identification, the grandiose attempt to master being through racial ideology and technological domination, the covering over of anxiety through aggressive action and certainty about who belongs and who must be excluded. Both thinkers can help us understand different dimensions of evil not as something simply external, not as the act of monsters wholly different from ourselves, but as possibilities within human existence that must be acknowledged, confronted, consciously integrated or resisted. The capacity for cruelty, for projection, for flight into collective movements that promise certainty and power, these are human possibilities, not aberrations but potentials that require vigilant consciousness. And both suggest that the response to evil is not simply moral condemnation or external control, but transformation of consciousness, individuation, authenticity changes in how we exist, not merely what we do. This is not to minimize the importance of ethics or law, but to recognize that deep evil requires deep response, changes at the level of the psyche or of being itself, not merely behavioral modification. The question of hope arises as we contemplate the depths both thinkers explored. Is their vision ultimately hopeful or despairing? Both saw clearly the dangers of modernity, the loss of meaning, the power of unconscious forces or technological domination. Both refused easy optimism or faith in progress, yet neither entirely despaired. Jung's trust in the self, and the psyche's inherent movement toward wholeness, provides a kind of hope. Even in the darkest times, the individuation process continues. The unconscious compensates for consciousness's one-sidedness, producing symbols and experiences that call us toward balance. The self is reliable, even when it manifests in disturbing forms. Transformation is always possible for the individual willing to do the work. Heidegger's later openness to the possibility that being might grant itself anew, that a turning might occur, that we can prepare through meditative thinking and authentic dwelling, even if we cannot force the change. This too is a kind of hope, though austere and uncertain, The last god might yet come, the gods might return. Or they might not. But our waiting and preparing is not meaningless even if no transformation occurs within our lifetime. Both forms of hope are non-naive, chastened by awareness of how deep the crisis is, how powerful the forces of unconsciousness or technological enframing. Neither promises that things will work out, that humanity will survive, that meaning will be restored. But both insist that the effort matters, that consciousness and authenticity are worthwhile even if collective transformation does not occur, that depth remains accessible to those who seek it. In this sense, both thinkers offer resources for living in uncertain, difficult times, not by promising solutions or guaranteeing outcomes, but by providing ways to dwell in the difficulty without denial, to remain open to depths while facing the surface catastrophes, to continue the work of consciousness or authentic thinking even when results are not visible. The aesthetic dimension deserves attention as we near the end of our exploration. Both Jung and Heidegger were deeply engaged with art, though in different ways. Jung analyzed art as expression of psychic contents, seeing in paintings, literature, and myth the manifestation of archetypal patterns. The artist, for Jung, is someone through whom the collective unconscious speaks, giving form to images that the culture needs even if the artist doesn't fully understand what is being expressed. Jung's own artistic practices, his paintings in the Red Book, his stone carvings, his tower at Bollingen were ways of giving form to unconscious contents, of allowing psychic realities to manifest in material form. The process of creating was itself therapeutic, a form of active imagination in stone and paint. Heidegger's engagement with art, particularly in his essays on poetry and on the work of art, emphasized art's revelatory function. The artwork opens a world, lets truth happen, brings forth the strife between world and earth. Van Gogh's painting of peasant shoes reveals the world of the peasant, the earth they walk on, the whole context of meaning in which these simple objects participate. Poetry names what is, lets beings be in their being, opens the space in which truth can occur. For Heidegger, great art is not merely expression of subjective feelings or creative imagination, but a way that being comes to presence, that unconcealment happens. The poet is one who listens to being's address and responds, giving it words. This is not a skill that can be taught or a technique that can be mastered, but a calling, a destiny, a granted capacity to stand in the clearing where being speaks. There is common ground here between Jung's vision of the artist as mediator of collective unconscious contents and Heidegger's vision of art as site of truth's occurrence. Both see art as more than subjective expression, as revealing dimensions of reality that exceed individual psychology or perspective. Both value art that has depth, that connects to something transpersonal or transsubjective. But Jung's language of archetypes and symbols might seem to Heidegger too psychologistic, reducing art's ontological power to psychological structures. And Heidegger's insistence on art as truth happening might seem to Jung insufficiently attentive to how art actually works on the psyche, how specific symbols and images affect consciousness and facilitate transformation. Again, the tension is between psychological and ontological frameworks, between concern with individual transformation and concern with being's unconcealment. And again, perhaps both perspectives are needed, recognizing art's psychological effects while also honoring its ontological depth, attending to how images work on the psyche while also recognizing that great art reveals being itself. Music represents an interesting case. Jung wrote less about music than about visual symbols and myths, though he recognized music's power to evoke archetypal moods and energies. Music operates in time rather than space, works on feeling rather than image, has a more direct emotional impact that bypasses rational consciousness. The Dionysian aspect of music, its capacity to dissolve ego boundaries, to induce possession or ecstasy, fascinated and disturbed Jung. Heidegger also wrote little about music, though his emphasis on rhythm, timing, the temporality of existence suggests connections. Music might be understood as pure temporality, made audible, the streaming of time itself given form. In music, the three ecstasies of time, past, present, future, are unified in the unfolding phrase, the anticipation and resolution, the memory and expectation that shape each moment of listening. Both thinkers might appreciate music that has depth, that is not merely entertainment or emotional stimulation, but that opens spaces, reveals moods, lets something be that otherwise remains hidden. The music of Bach, which both Jung and Heidegger admired, has this quality of architectural wholeness combined with temporal unfolding, form made fluid, the transcendent and the immediate unified. The question of practice remains crucial. What do these ideas mean for how we actually live? Jung offers specific practices: dream journaling, active imagination, attending to synchronicities, exploring one's myth, working with a trained analyst. These practices are accessible, can be taught, have demonstrable effects on psychological well-being and consciousness. Heidegger offers meditative thinking, attentiveness to language, dwelling, releasement practices that are less specific, less technique-oriented, more about a fundamental attitude or way of being. One does not do meditative thinking as a scheduled practice, but shifts into a different mode of relation to existence, questions rather than calculates, listens rather than imposes. Can these be combined? One might keep a dream journal and practice active imagination, Jungian practices, while also cultivating meditative awareness of one's finitude and attentiveness to being's presencing, Heideggerian practices. The dreamer who works with archetypal images might also hold awareness of their thrownness, their being toward death, their existence as possibility rather than fixed essence. The challenge is not to collapse the differences between these approaches, but to hold them in productive tension, letting each illuminate aspects that the other leaves in shadow. Jung's psychology provides richness of content, specific guidance for working with inner life. Heidegger's ontology provides existential depth, awareness of structures that make psychological experience possible. As we approach the close of our long meditation, let us return to where we began with two thinkers who never met, who wrote in different registers about different dimensions of human existence, yet who share deep concerns about authenticity, depth, meaning in an age of surface and calculation. Jung's vision of the psyche as containing collective archetypal depths, as naturally moving toward wholeness through symbols and integration, provides hope and practical guidance for individuals seeking meaning and healing. His emphasis on the living symbol, on the autonomous reality of the unconscious, on the numinous power of the self, honors dimensions of experience that reductive materialism dismisses, but that feel most real to those who encounter them. Heidegger's existential ontological analysis of Dasein, his insistence on finitude and authenticity, his critique of metaphysics and technology, his later meditations on being and dwelling, provide philosophical depth and existential clarity. His refusal of easy answers, his austere emphasis on facing the nothing and anticipating death, his openness to mystery without attempting to domesticate it. All of this prevents psychology from becoming too comfortable, too therapeutic, too removed from the radical questions of existence. Together, they offer resources for thinking and living that honor both psyche and being, both the imaginal richness of interior life and the ontological structures of existence. They converge in valuing authenticity over conformity, depth over surface, symbolic or meditative awareness over calculation. They diverge in their methods, vocabularies, ultimate concerns. Jung oriented toward healing and wholeness, Heidegger toward truth and being. For those of us living in the 21st century, struggling with even more advanced forms of technological domination, even more pervasive loss of meaning, even more sophisticated ways of avoiding depth, both thinkers remain provocative guides. Jung reminds us that the psyche is real, that symbols matter, that dreams speak truths that waking consciousness misses, that transformation is possible through engaging our depths. Heidegger reminds us that being exceeds our categories, that authenticity requires facing finitude, that meditative thinking offers an alternative to calculative manipulation, that dwelling and releasement remain possible even in the midst of technological enframing. Neither offers complete answers. Both made mistakes, theoretical and personal. Both can be criticized from various perspectives: feminist, post-colonial, scientific, theological. Their involvement with or ambiguous response to Nazism must be acknowledged and grappled with, not explained away. Yet, the depths they explored, the maps they drew, the questions they asked continue to matter. The dialogue between them, though never enacted historically, can be enacted by us reading both, thinking with both, allowing their different perspectives to sharpen each other, using their insights to navigate our own journeys toward authenticity or individuation or whatever we call that movement toward living more truly from our depths. As you drift toward sleep, let these ideas settle like snow falling on a mountain path. There is no need to grasp or hold them. They will work on you in ways you cannot control, perhaps appearing in dreams, perhaps shifting how you experience your own existence tomorrow. The conversation between Jung and Heidegger continues in everyone who engages seriously with questions of depth and authenticity, who refuses the surface comforts of modern life in order to face what is difficult and real. Rest now in the awareness that your existence, too, is structured by the dimensions they explored, by archetypes and by thrownness, by symbols and by being, by the call to become who you are and the mystery of what it means to be at all. The journey toward depth is endless, and you are always already underway, whether you name it individuation or authenticity or simply learning to live more truly. May your sleep be deep, your dreams revealing, your waking tomorrow attuned to depths you had forgotten were there. The conversation continues in the silence between words, in the pause between breaths, in the space where consciousness touches what exceeds it. Jung and Heidegger, psychologist and philosopher, each in his own way, invite us into that space, that depth, that home we never left and are always seeking. The path winds on through forest and psyche, through being and becoming. Walk it with awareness, with symbols for company, with questions rather than answers, with openness to what shows itself. The goal is not to arrive, but to dwell in the journey, to live from depth rather than surface, to honor both the light of consciousness and the darkness from which it emerges and to which it returns. Sleep well, wanderer of inner and outer worlds. The depths will be here when you wake, patient, mysterious, inexhaustible. Jung mapped some of their contours, Heidegger questioned their very ground, and you continue the exploration in the unique way that is yours alone to walk. The conversation has no end, only infinite variations on the eternal themes of seeking authenticity in an inauthentic age, finding meaning in a disenchanted world, becoming conscious in the vast unconsciousness that surrounds and contains us, dwelling authentically on the earth under the sky, mortal yet open to what transcends mortality, thrown into existence yet free to project possibilities, psychological beings whose psychology opens onto the question of being itself. Rest now. The work continues while you sleep, in dreams and in the slow transformation that occurs when depth has been honored, when questions have been asked, when two great minds have been allowed to speak across the silence, illuminating for a moment the mystery of what we are and what it means to be at all.